The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. On today's episode, NPR's Student Podcast Challenge drew more than 3,000 submissions this year, but only about 24 were selected as finalists. We'll speak with two of the students recognized in the competition for their piece, and a new report examines gaps in teacher retention. I'm Lucas Willard, host of The Best of Our Knowledge. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I am Lucas Willard. As part of its 5th year of the program, the NPR Education Desk this summer announced the winners of its Student Podcast Challenge. The challenge is open to middle and high school students across the country, and over the years, judges have listened to tens of thousands of submissions from all 50 states. There's also a college podcast challenge. Earlier this year, The Best of Our Knowledge spoke with Student Podcast Challenge's Steve Drummond about what makes a great podcast.
You can do a very fine podcast with nothing more than a cell phone and a laptop. The thing that really stands out for us across the middle school and the high school grades are the passion and the real interest that the students bring to their topic. If there's something they're really excited and really engaged with and a story that they really want to tell, that comes through more than any other single thing.
Students have submitted podcasts about everything from tattoos to tater tots, but Drummond says participants in the Student Podcast Challenge have often looked inward for inspiration.
As you would expect, adolescents are really struggling at that period in life to figure out who they are. And a lot of our best podcasts and our best stories have come with students exploring their race or identity or ethnic backgrounds or their family histories. We've had podcasts from a student with autism. We've had a podcast from a student who is deaf. We've had all kinds of podcasts of students exploring who they are and where they belong in the world. And oftentimes those have been really, really compelling standouts.
Of more than 3,300 entries from amateur media makers in 2023, the largest pool of submissions to date, there were just over 24 finalists, with 13 middle school and 13 high school finalists, including the students we'll hear from next. Hailing from the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York, rising seniors Patty Kongsumjit and Narmeen Omar were recognized for their podcast called OCD 101. It explores living with obsessive-compulsive disorder and raises awareness to its complexities. The Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan spoke with the students about what went into their podcast's production, how it feels to be heard on a national platform, and how they met. In this interview, Patty speaks first.
We were both new sophomores, so we met at the start of the year and we became very close because we had similar interests and stuff. But it wasn't until the end of our sophomore year that we found out that we both kind of had this link with both of us having OCD.
And how were you introduced to the idea of the NPR Student Podcast Challenge?
We heard about this challenge while we were doing a class called Signature, which is the project we were doing together. Me and Patty have both created a series of episodes of podcasts, and our instructor told us that, since you guys are doing a podcast, how about you guys try out the NPR Podcast Challenge, as previous students have tried it before. And we thought it was a good idea, and we created our first episode, and we entered that in the podcast challenge.
Before your work on this project, were there any podcasts that you were fans of or that you listened to at all?
I have listened to a few podcasts before, but I wouldn't have said that I was very into podcasts. But I thought it was a interesting way to deliver a message. I remember originally I thought of maybe creating newsletters, but at the end we decided of doing a podcast.
And now that you've been introduced to this ocean of podcasts that are out there, do you have any that you consider a favorite?
Personally, I really like Fresh Air by Terry Gross. It's I started listening to it pretty recently.
For me, I've listened to very random podcast episodes, but I remember my dad listens to NPR a lot, so I've listened to NPR with him before.
So let's jump into your podcast, OCD 101. What were each of your roles in putting this together?
In the beginning, we kind of did it together, but I usually do editing, and Patty's role is like writing scripts. We kind of like dividing up the work to make it a bit easier.
Most of the stuff we do is very collaborative. We work on basically everything together. Like we bounce ideas off of each other. But for me, I'm mostly in charge of writing what the storyline of like how we want our episode to look like.
And how did you decide that obsessive compulsive disorder would be the topic of focus for your podcast?
Narmeen and I were friends, but we didn't know that both of us had OCD until like the end of our sophomore year. So when we found out, it was like a really big thing for us because neither of us had like met anybody else who had OCD before. So we were able to get a lot closer because there were things that we could talk about that the other person could understand, but like other people wouldn't understand. So there's a lot of things that like we sympathize with each other about. We really thought that like OCD was something that people didn't know much about, and there were a lot of misconceptions out there in the media.
We both know how harmful some of the misconceptions of OCD could be. So we decided that maybe we can do something for our like project to educate people more about OCD.
With so many topics and so much to talk about, how did you decide on what content would make it to your series?
At first, we were thinking of doing more of like a general overview, then continuing and doing more specific topics that relate with OCD. Like the second episode we created was about media and media portrayal of OCD.
So we had 3 episodes in total. But for the third one, we kind of wanted to switch it up a bit because before this, it was just both of us talking about our own experiences. So we wanted to kind of get another perspective. So we decided to send a survey out to our school to see if there was any other student out there who also had obsessive compulsive disorder and would be willing to share like their experience and their story, like whether anonymously or not. And we got one response from a student who did want to remain anonymous, and we were able to interview them and like get a lot of insightful stories from them, which we included in our podcast.
You both live every day with obsessive compulsive disorder. Were there any specific ways that having OCD directly affected the production process of your podcast?
I think that it just kind of made the podcast have a more kind of personal feel, I guess, because we were both able to contribute our own experiences and stories. So it wasn't just like we did like research on the internet or like with Miss McCarthy Shaw and we got information about what OCD is. We were able to speak like from the firsthand perspective, like from the I perspective, to really talk about like what it was like personally for us to live with like our OCD and like our own like obsessions and compulsions.
Yeah, I think that if we really, both of us didn't have OCD, maybe this podcast wouldn't have happened because that's how we got the idea of making this podcast. Because originally we were like, hey, we both have OCD. Why don't we make a project about that? Because it's something that we both have like firsthand experience with. And I feel like when you're someone who already has the firsthand experience, it's kind of a lot more easier to create the podcast because then we know like, oh, what are things that feel home to us? What are some topics we want to be talked about more? And then we create the episodes and be like, okay, like we know that there's not maybe enough media portrayal that's accurate in OCD, or maybe people should hear from a professional what like OCD is like, also from like stories of also a student who has OCD like us.
You present a lot of great information and you sound like the experts in your podcast. I'm curious to know, what is it that you learned while making it?
The thing that I most enjoyed from making this podcast was the conversations that I was able to have with Narmeen, because I have OCD, but I have one, like it's my own only experience, like the only thing that I've known. But through making this podcast with Narmeen, I got to hear kind of another person's perspective on what living with OCD could look like. I learned a lot, not just from like the research and like talking to Miss McCarthy Shaw, but I also learned a lot from the conversations that I had with Narmeen. And it just opened my eyes to what OCD could look like.
Talking with Patty, both of us have kind of different types of OCD. We both know how it feels like to have OCD, and we can rely on each other, be like, oh, I know how it can feel hard when maybe other people cannot understand why we feel this way.
And so this is exciting. You made it to the finalist stage of the podcast challenge here. What was it like to find out you'd been selected?
I remember like I just woke up one morning and then I saw the email. I was like, hey, you and Armin were selected as 1 out of 13 finalists. And I was just kind of like, what? Because I really did not expect it at all. Like it wasn't like our goal going into this competition wasn't like to be a finalist or to win. It was just like we wanted to share our experiences. So hopefully a lot of more people will learn more about OCDs through our podcast.
I remember we submitted the episode around like January or December, and it's kind of been in the back of my mind. I always thought like, oh, there's so much people. I felt like it was kind of unreachable to be a finalist, but I thought it would be like, we can try, but it's probably not going to happen.
Do either of you see a continuation of this podcast or a potential future to develop something new?
In terms of our podcast on OCD, me and Armin have been talking, and we're definitely going to continue that like throughout the rest of our high school journey. But for me personally, I'm also like from what I've learned from making this podcast with Narmeen for my senior year, I also I'm planning on making a podcast where I interview female leaders, so like different women executives from like different fields, and to kind of like get their advice and kind of help inspire like the next generation of women leaders, because both Narmeen and I like attend an all-girls high school, and that's just kind of been something that I've always been passionate about, like empowering other women.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll not do the podcast like with our instructors in such a formal way, but definitely we do want to continue like a few more episodes, at least in our senior year, and maybe who knows in the future. But right now we do plan on creating a few more episodes.
From those that have listened, what kind of response did you get? And was there any memorable feedback that you got?
I just remember getting feedback that I talk too fast. So that's something I'm going to keep in mind when I make the next episodes.
In general, I think the feedback we've received has been like pretty positive. Like we've had like our classmates and our teachers were all like, oh, you guys sound like professional like podcasters, stuff like that.
What do your parents think of all this? Have you shared any of this experience with them?
I did not even tell my parents that I made a podcast. And they only knew like when our teachers told us that we were a finalist. So it was just like I wasn't even gonna mention it to my parents. But then I did tell my little sister about it, and she mentioned it while we were having breakfast or something. She was like, oh, hey, did Patty tell you about the thing with her podcast and the competition? And they were like, what podcast? So yeah, I did not tell them about it before. And I think Narmeen is also kind of in a similar situation.
Yeah, I haven't told my parents at all that I've been doing a podcast, and I haven't told them that I won anything. I kind of, because with like certain like cultures, like mental health isn't that accepted. So even though my parents know I have OCD, sometimes I don't feel like they understand it fully. So sometimes I'm like, it's better to just do this on my own. So I haven't told that. I've told my cousin. She was like, oh my God, you won. And I told her like, yeah, I did this podcast. So I've told like my cousin, but I haven't told my parents. I probably would tell my younger sister too.
That's Patty Kongsumjit and Narmeen Omar, rising seniors at the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York, and finalists in the 2023 NPR Student Podcast Challenge. They spoke with the best of our knowledge's Jody Cowan. Now let's listen to their submission, the first episode of their podcast, OCD 101.
Imagine spending 2 hours every single day checking your house to make sure that all your doors are locked, or turning the lights on and off 15 times before you can go to bed, or even being late to work because you have to listen to a specific song 3 times before you can leave your house in the morning. These are only a few examples of what obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, can look like for people who struggle with it. My name is Patty, and I am currently a junior in high school, and I have OCD. With me today is a great friend of mine and my partner in making this podcast.
Hi, my name is Narmeen, and I'm also a junior in high school, and I have OCD. As two of the approximately 160 million people in this world with OCD, we have experienced firsthand how hard it is to live with this disorder. Even though a huge population of the world has OCD, It's a mental disorder that's immensely misunderstood and misportrayed in media as well as in daily life. The term OCD gets thrown around on a daily basis and is mostly used as an adjective. I've encountered people saying things like, "Oh, I'm so OCD about organizing my desk," or, "Oh, I'm a little OCD." Essentially, OCD has been reduced to just a personality trait that's all about liking to stay clean and tidy instead of this actual mental disorder that greatly affects so many people's lives.
Yeah, so these misconceptions and misunderstandings of OCD were our driving force for creating this podcast. We want to help bring awareness to and educate people about this disorder. And since we both have firsthand experience of living with OCD, we wanted to use what we have learned over the years to help people learn a little bit more about what it is. Throughout the podcast, you also get to hear segments of our interview with Ms. Erin McCarthy-Shaw, who is a psychiatric nurse practitioner with experience working with OCD. So definitely stay tuned for that. And without further ado, here is OCD 101, the podcast.
What exactly is OCD? OCD stands for the obsessive compulsive disorder. As the name suggests, there are two parts to OCD, the obsessive and the compulsive. A person who has OCD has certain intrusive thoughts called obsessions, which are unwanted and constant thoughts that cause distress, anxiety, and fear. To alleviate the distress, anxiety, and fear that they feel, a person with OCD engages in such behaviors and actions called compulsions. Although every person has intrusive thoughts at least once in their lives, a person with OCD experiences intrusive thoughts on the daily basis. And these thoughts and repetitive behaviors that follow them consume a significant amount of energy in their daily lives and cause them immense stress.
Some common obsessions and compulsions that certain people with OCD may experience are a fear of contamination, so like a fear of being dirty or contracting a disease, which could lead to their compulsions being excessive hand washing or cleaning. Another common obsession is what is called harm OCD.
If somebody is having aggressive thoughts or urges to hurt somebody, even though they have absolutely no desire to hurt somebody, they're terrified to bring it up. The reality of OCD is that they're having an obsessive, intrusive, unwanted thought.
Yeah, and I think the thing with OCD too is that some people don't realize that it's such a scary disorder that makes you feel so alone because you have these terrifying thoughts that make you so anxious. And Erin talked a little bit about this during our interview, like how OCD can really make you question everything about yourself and who you are.
Most people are so horrified by what they're experiencing that their first thought is, no one is ever going to understand this. How could anyone possibly understand this? How could anyone go through this? It has to just be me.
And the obsession that most people probably think of when they think about OCD is what's called perfectionist OCD, which is when the person feels this need for things to be completely symmetrical or organized. This is actually something that I personally struggle with. My OCD is mainly about symmetry and like organizing, and I really hate it when things are asymmetrical. So like when I'm working on my laptop, I'll line my laptop up so that it's symmetrical to like the edge of my desk. And I also have like specific places where I have to put my things, and I have a specific bedtime routine. And like if I don't do these things, I get this really unsettling feeling in my stomach, and I'm just left feeling anxious and scared for the rest of the day. So I'm just stuck performing these repetitive compulsions for a significant part of my day, and it just leaves me feeling so alone and isolated.
One of the other pieces too that's really important is that often with people with OCD, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, you know that the compulsions and the obsessions are illogical.
Yeah, and just like what Erin said, I think the thing with OCD, most of us with OCD actually know that our intrusive thoughts are irrational and unreasonable, but we are often unable to ignore these thoughts. For me, my OCD comes in the shape of being constantly obsessed with things being contaminated. When I use the bathroom, I constantly feel as though I'm not clean enough, which causes me to try to clean myself constantly. We
don't fully understand what is happening in the brain with OCD. But one of the things that we do know is that the orbitofrontal cortex is involved, which is really important with decision making, and the basal ganglia. And so there's overactivity in these brain areas. And so when there's overactivity in these brain areas, we know that obsessions and compulsions tend to increase and become more unmanageable. So again, it's a very complex process, but unfortunately, we're talking about with OCD, the more you try to suppress it, the more it comes back and the more it reinforces things.
How about you, Patty? Do you have any other, any experiences about telling people about your OCD?
Most of the time when I tell people I have OCD, they'll probably say something like, oh yeah, me too, I also have OCD, which is just really I don't know, because most people, it also comes from the misportrayals that's shown in the media of how OCD is portrayed. So it's OCD is just this thing that's all about liking to stay clean and organized, but there's so much more to OCD than what's actually shown in movies and TV shows, and that people just don't realize it.
Yeah, I remember having some of my friends one of my friends really liked to clean her room and just keep things clean, but not to an obsessive level. And one of our other friends joked oh my god, you probably have OCD. And then I just remember feeling so annoyed, because I was OCD is just not it can be sometimes people cleaning things constantly, but for her, she was just cleaning things to a normal level, and it was not taking her much time.
Yeah, that's the difference between liking to stay clean and actually having cleanliness OCD, because it just, with OCD, it just takes hours and hours out of your day, and you just it's not you actually want to do it, it's just you don't know how to stop.
My role is to, people come in, I diagnose and treat, but it's a team effort. And in that, I mean, it's not just the therapist and myself, it's also the people who are experiencing it and loved ones coming forward and telling their stories, because I can tell you what my experiences have been as a mental health professional, but sometimes people need to hear from somebody who has actually experienced it. It's such an empowering feeling when somebody else is going through the same thing and you realize you're not alone. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The first episode of OCD 101 was produced by high schoolers Patty Kumsungjit and Narmeen Omar, rising seniors at the Emma Willard School in Shore, New York. The students were finalists in NPR's 2023 Student Podcast Challenge. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. Data from the last few years shows that public schools in New York are having difficulties retaining teachers of color, and that students of color are disproportionately concentrated in schools with the lowest teacher retention rates. To learn more about the report by the New York Equity Coalition, I spoke with Dia Bryant, Executive Director of the Education Trust New York.
I think that one of the big things that we see here is you see retention in some of the more urban areas like Buffalo, Rochester, Yonkers, and Syracuse, much lower than our sort of more affluent districts. So our low need districts are seeing retention gaps, so to speak, and they're losing teachers at a higher rate than some of the more affluent districts. Districts with fewer students from low-income backgrounds have some of the highest retention rates for teachers of color. And it calls into question sort of what's the difference in teaching conditions in some of the affluent schools and school communities versus those that are almost 10 percentage points lower in our more lower income, more needy school districts.
So one of the biggest numbers that this report highlights is the 9-point percentage gap between Black teachers and white teachers when it comes to retention rates. Was that number surprising to the New York Equity Coalition?
I believe so. I think we've always known that this is a challenge, but I don't know that we've given it the attention that's actually necessary, right? I think there's another trend happening here that I don't know if the report really calls up very clearly, but it's just that many teachers were moving from our urban areas where there's high need, high concentrations of poverty, and high concentrations of students of color into our more low need, more affluent school districts. And I think what's missed in this is that students from all racial backgrounds should be taught by a diverse teacher workforce. And retaining teachers of color is critical to that, right? So that's sort of how we were thinking about it.
This report also points out a gap, a disparity between the percentage of teachers who represent minority populations versus their share of students that are also of minority populations.
Right. And so what we know for sure is that our teacher workforce does not at all reflect the diversity of not just our state, but of our student populations. And I think that that's what you're calling out. And a lot of the research that we know says that students of color and non-students of color benefit from having diverse teachers. And what this does is students of color who have a teacher of same race or same ethnicity often experience a better environment with higher expectations, often free of some of the biases that we've tried to mitigate in our teacher workforce in the education sector. Teachers of color often see students of color with more potential than their white counterparts. And that research has been very strong. And so I am excited that this year, through the legislative process, we have a new bill from Nader and Liu that will actually have our New York State Education Department monitor how the local education agencies work on this issue and how they think about diversifying their workforce locally.
What does the data in the New York Equity Coalition's report not tell us that needs really some more research?
It doesn't tell us why teachers of color are leaving, right? Or why they're moving from certain types of areas to another. However, we held focus groups to really inform how we were thinking about this data, and we hope to follow it up soon with some of that information. But teachers are really looking for opportunities for wealth building. Often we focus on salary, but I think that there are many other things that we can do to support them in building wealth. Housing vouchers, vouchers for free education, perhaps. It's, in New York State, you got to have a master's degree within 5 years of starting the profession. And those higher education opportunities are not cheap. So we want to make sure that the ROI for educators is actually there, and that teachers feel like they can have a living, have a family, and not forego some of the wealth building things like building a retirement or buying a home in order to do the thing that they love, which is work with children.
Dia Bryant is Executive Director of the Education Trust New York. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1716. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to associate producer Jody Cowan. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Lucas Willard.